Hello everyone and welcome back to the World Chess Championship 2021. It's Magnus Carlsen versus Nepomniachtchi, and this is, well, game 4. The first 3 games were very exciting, or rather the first 2 games were very exciting. The third one, maybe not so much to some of you or to most of you, even though it was proclaimed the most accurate World Chess Championship game ever played. No one really cares much about that because we're interested in human moves pretty much, so, you know, it being the most accurate game ever played. I don't think that really impresses anyone all that much, you know, and unless you're keeping, you know, statistics. But if you remember, game 1 was, well, there was some fight in game 1. Game 2, there was plenty of fight. Magnus had a beautiful knight on d6 for the entire game, and, well, he sacrificed the exchange. Later, Nepo had to give back the exchange. Magnus was up a pawn, and in the end, the players agreed to a draw. Magnus again had to, give up that knight for a knight and a pawn for a rook. In game 3, we had that early draw, and now everyone is wondering, will we have a repetition of game 2 where Magnus went for that crazy 95 Catalan with the white pieces, or will we have something else? So before we check out the game, let's check out some photos here. We have a nice incoming handshake by Nepo here. You can see that Nepo is attempting to establish a full eye contact here, and the Magnus not sure whether to accept the eye contact or not. If you checked the actual video, I think there was a moment where the eye contact was established for a brief moment, but only for a brief moment. But Nepo went in for it very bravely, as you can see. And also, this is the gentleman that made the first move for Magnus. I have no idea who that is. If you guys know, do share in the comments so we can all increase our vast knowledge. That being said, let's check it out. Magnus has the white pieces, and no, he does not open with the d4. He opens with e4, and this is the moment where we find out what Nepo has prepared for e4. Of course, he prepared e5, knight to f3. We have knight to f6, so not going for some sort of a Rui Lopez or maybe an Italian game with black, but rather going for the Petrov defense or the Russian defense. And well, this can go many ways. If you guys remember, Magnus and Caruana played this in their 2018 London match. So here we have knight captures on e5, going for the classical variation, accepting this pawn, even if only temporarily. d6, knight back to f3, and the knight captures on e4. Nepo now wins back the pawn. And now you could continue with something like knight to c3. This is a very interesting line where white, gets his pawns doubled very early on in the game, but he will get a lot of development for this. But here, Magnus just continues with the so-called classical attack. We have d4, d5, bishop to d3, and now bishop to d6. We have castles by both sides, and now white plays c4. So if you've ever studied the Petrov and you tried even employing it in one maybe classical game, chances are you've had this exact same position on the board. So we have c6, adding more protection to the d5 pawn, rook to e1, and now bishop to f5. So this is all very standard stuff, many games in the database with all of these exact same ideas. And here, by playing bishop to f5, Nepo weakened the b7 pawn, so queen to b3, going after the b7 pawn, and queen to d7, nicely defending this pawn. We have knight to c3 now, putting more pressure here on the center, and Nepo trades on c3. We have knight captures, now bishop captures on f5, forcing the queen to move. Queen captures on f5, b captures on c3, and now as the b7 pawn is still hanging, we have b6. C captures on d5, C captures, and now queen to b5. So again, this has all been seen before, a very stifling move by Magnus, not allowing this knight to develop. You can't really do all that much with the e8 square. Both the queen and the rook are controlling that, so it's really time to get rid of that queen from b5. So Nepo goes back, queen to d7, and now we have a4 by Magnus. The idea is, as black has 2 pawns on the queen side and Magnus has only 1, you can use this 1 pawn to sort of blockade the 2 pawns black has. Nepo captures on b5, and here we have a captures on b5. We have a5 now. Of course, if you don't play this, if you just develop, it's very hard to do something about it. If you play knight to d7, then how are you ever getting this rook into the game? This pawn will be a target for the rest of the game. So you have to play a5, and of course, you're expecting b captures on a6 en passant, but not this is not what happens. So this is a known move, but the move Magnus plays is not a known move. He plays knight to h4, and it's a really weird move, but also as of move 18, we have a completely new game, and you can't really just come up with this idea, because it's not even in the first 3 engine recommendations. The engine, in fact, says it's not a move that's all that impressive, but it's what Magnus played, and now what can Nepo play? Well, of course, we do not want to allow knight to f5. So Nepo played a g6 fairly quickly. Of course, we want to prevent this knight from reaching this square, and now we have g4 by Magnus. We have knight to d7. Now you can continue development, as your a5 pawn is nicely placed here, and also it's a passed pawn. So if white is not careful, that pawn could start running down the board. And here we have knight to g2. Now, the knight can come, for example, to e3, and it will put pressure on that d5 pawn. And also, it controls the f4 square, so you can play bishop to f4 if you want to challenge black's strong bishop on d6. And here, Jan spent some 23 minutes contemplating his next move, and he decided to play rook f to c8. And this is a very important move in the game, as I believe this is not what Carlsen and his team had in mind when they chose this position for this game, or rather chose this opening idea. The thing is, they probably thought he would go knight to f6 first, because it kind of comes with tempo. You attack the g4 pawn. We're going to attack the rook first, bishop to h6, but now you can't really bring the rook to c8, because the knight will come to e3 and put pressure on that d5 pawn. So, for example, rook f to d8, and now knight to e3. We defend our g4 pawn while we put pressure on the d5 pawn, and now bishop to f8. We want to remove this bishop from h6. Let's say bishop g5, king g7, and this is maybe one of the positions that Magnus and the team had in mind. But Nepo, after spending some 23 minutes, decided to play rook f to c8, and now it's a bit of a different story. The c3 pawn now is hanging. So how do you react to this? Well, there's only one good way to react to this, and that's to not react to it. Here's bishop to f4. So putting pressure on this bishop. And the idea is, of course, if bishop captures, knight captures, then we are attacking the d5 pawn, then attacking the b6 pawn, and hopefully we're going to be attacking a lot of pawns. And here, again, after some consideration, not a lot, both Nepo and Magnus played their moves fairly quickly. Nepo did spend a bit more time, but in the end, he played bishop captures on f4. An interesting move here is bishop back to b8. It's, not in anyone's way. You do disconnect the rooks for a moment, but the downside is that you allow rook to e7, and you never want to allow this rook lift. While the bishop was on d6, you were guarding that e7 square. But let's say knight to f6, we're going to play rook to b7, go after the b6 pawn. Now we're going to play knight to e4, we're going to go after the c3 pawn. And now let's say rook captures on b6, now we capture on f4, and after knight captures on c3. And it's a very interesting position where black still has this beautiful a pawn, but white has the passed b pawn. But it, again, if you're not, playing this with surgical precision, it doesn't appear like you're going to be able to do anything here. So after bishop to f4, we have bishop captures on f4. This is sort of the main line of this combination. Knight captures on f4, we have rook captures on c3, and knight captures on d5. Attacking the rook, here putting pressure on the b6 pawn, and also, with ideas of knight to f6 check if this knight ever moves from d7. We have rook to d3, going after the d4 pawn, and Magnus goes for the rook lift, rook to e7. And now you have to be careful here. Your knight is hanging. If the knight moves, the b6 pawn is hanging. If you're really not careful, rook to c1 to c7, and then you really have problems along the 7th rank. So here Nepo plays knight to f8. It's the only good square for the knight, and basically the only move black has. And now, again, you have to figure out how to continue this. Magnus spent over 20 minutes on his next move, because there's quite a lot to consider. For example, you could just grab the pawn, knight captures on b6, then we have, okay, the rook is attacked, we have to move the rook to b8, attacks the knight moves back, we're going to capture on d4. You could capture something else, you could capture on b5, you could capture on d4, you could first bring the knight into the game, so it really doesn't matter. But let's say rook captures on d4, knight to f6 with check, king g7, we're going to play knight to e8 check, and now even king to h6 is possible. So there are positions that could be reached reached it this way. For example, rook captures on a5, we get rid of this nasty pawn. Rook captures on g4 with check king to f1, and you continue playing this game with sort of equal material. Well, for the moment, with the exact equal material, but it's very unbalanced, and Magnus decides against it. So instead of this capture, he could play rook 8 to e1. Also a very interesting move, just double up on the e file and try to put immense pressure on the black king's position. But now let's say rook captures on d4. Again, knight to f6 check, king g7 and g5 now. Looks very, very interesting, but now black starts pushing the pawn a4, and well, knight to e8 check, king g8, knight to f6 check, king g7, knight to e8 check. We get a threefold repetition. So instead, after knight to f8, Magnus did not go for either of those two ideas. He went knight to f6 check first, king to g7, and now he repeats knight to e8 check, king g8, and now we have d5. You could also go for the repetition here and just claim a draw, but you have the white pieces, and the thing is, regardless of what white plays and regardless of what black plays, you can always play this idea on the next move. So you might as well try something. So here Magnus goes for d5. It's a very nice pawn push. It's a pass pawn, and you cannot capture it. If you capture it, knight f6 check, and the rook is just lost. So here, after this d5 move, what can Nepo play? Well, you have to start pushing the pass pawn. The pass pawn, it's like when it's here, it's an order of magnitude weaker than when you push it here, and then again here. It just grows in strength tremendously. So here Magnus goes knight to f6 with check, king to g7, and now everyone thought that he was just going to repeat the position because this is kind of a strong pass pawn. But for the moment, g5. So he puts more pressure on Nepo's king, and Nepo just continues pushing a3. Now look at this pass pawn already on a3, looking incredibly dangerous. And here there are so many things you can consider. We're going to show some of them. We're going to explain, well, two of my favorite ones. But Magnus spent almost 40 minutes here, so some 35 minutes, but he then, repeated the position a little bit and then considered the position a bit more. So what can you play here? Well, popular choices are h4. Of course, maybe going for some h5, h6 action, king to g2, getting the king into the game, king to f1. There are ideas of rook to c1 with a nice rook lift to c7. You could also start advancing the pawn right away with the d6. So I'm going to show you the two of my favorite ones. Is that, if you can advance the pawn to d6, it still can be captured because knight to e8 check, and now black has to give up the rook. In order not to lose an entire rook, you have to give up the exchange. So after d6, the problem is you give up your control over the e6 square. Then black can go knight to the e6, and then after d7, we can easily block it. Rook to d8, and now after rook to e8, putting pressure on that rook, you don't care. The rook's defended by the knight. You can just play h6, for example, attack the g5 pawn. h4, we're going to play captures, and now you might even try something like rook 3 to g7. Trying to give up that exchange for a pawn and a piece, but white can play rook captures on e6, let's say f captures on e6, knight captures on d7, rook captures on d7, and now rook captures on a3. But now when you look at the position, white didn't really achieve all that much. Rook d5, and it's black who's attacking the two pawns, so white can't really claim that he achieved anything. So that's what happens after d6, or the best thing that could happen for white. But there is the very interesting rook to c1 move. So you just completely don't care about a2, a1, and you want to play rook to c7 and checkmate the black king. So if this is possible, and probably something that Magnus spent quite a lot of time working out, then you should definitely play it. So let's see how this plays out. Pawn to a2, of course, and now there are two options. Do we go rook c to c7 and allow a1 queen? Well, if you allow this, then a1 queen comes with check. Well, that's one of the problems. King to g2. And now, okay, it doesn't seem like black can do any more checks, and this looks very scary. However, there are many ways black can avoid getting checkmated, king to h8 being one of them. And now after rook captures on f7, we can play rook to h3. Looks very nasty, but at least we're defending that h7 pawn 3 times with the rook, with the knight and the king, even though we're sacrificing a whole rook here. But there isn't a good move. If you capture it, then we just play queen to f1 check, and slowly but surely the white king will get checkmated. Rook to e3 check, king f4, queen captures on f2 with check, king e5, you can deliver some checks here, and well, long story short, you will get checkmated very, very nastily here. So here after rook to c1 and a2, you can't really go for this rook 1 to c7 idea, but you can go for rook captures on f7. Also a very nice idea. And after king captures on f7, rook to c7 check. Now look at this, the pawn covers e6, the knight covers e8, the rook of course covers e7 and g7, the knight covers g8. So what can you do here? It seems like the black king is checkmated. Well, almost, because you can block with the knight. Knight to d7, then we capture the knight with this rook move, king to f8, and now after knight captures on f7 check, we have this well-known setup where, well, it's just a draw because white can continue perpetually checking the black king. For example, if you go here, we're just going to play knight f6 check, check the king, defend the rook, you're going to go back, we again repeat this, and if you attack the knight, then we just play knight back to f6 with check, and you have to go back here, because if you go here, you get checkmated. So there's that. So you're going to have to go here, knight h7 check, and so on and so on. So this is one of the options. So rook to c1, as interesting as it is, it does not work because this pawn is on a3. If it was on a4, well, that would be a completely different story, but it's not. And all the other moves, they're just not fast enough. Nepo's pawn already on a3 is just a monster. So here, knight to e8 check by Magnus, like I said, after some 35 minutes of thinking about the position. King g8, knight to f6 check, king g7, knight to e8 check, king to g8, and knight to f6 check. And it was in this position on move 33 that Magnus and Nepo agreed to a draw, as there is nothing more to be done here, as you've seen. So I thought Magnus was trying to, as today is his 31st birthday, I thought that he was trying to make it so they agreed on a draw on move 31, but they in fact agreed on move 33. I guess maybe it was sort of his plan, but it didn't work out. Who knows? Maybe it's a silly thing, you know. But you know, he's done sillier things, so it could be you know, what he was going for. But yeah, that's game 4, so no crazy cattle, and this time we've seen a nice Petrov defense. We'll see what will Magnus go for in game 6. Will it be a d4 and e4, or maybe even something else? So it's not very often that you will see you know, such deviations. Usually if you try something in one game, then you will improve on it and employ it right in the next one. But here, not so much. From d4 straight to e4, we'll see what happens in the next one. So yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Game 5 coming up next. I would like to thank May the Fork be with you, Frederick Jakobson, Mark Epstein, Taras Karpiak, Darsun Kamkerten, and Michael Brooks for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot, I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the World Chess Championship until it ends. Thank you all, I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.